Welcome back to our discussion of the Century of Humiliation. In this lecture, we'll continue our examination of the fall of the Qing and the tragedy of the Japanese invasion of China. While faring poorly against the challenge from the West, the Qing was also weakening from within. There was significant unhappiness with the failure of the Qing to meet the challenge of the foreign threat. This partly gave rise to the Taiping Rebellion, led by Hong Xiuquan, who had failed the civil service exams, fallen into a deep depression, and somehow convinced himself that he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. He was able to attract thousands of followers and briefly enjoyed foreign support because of his quasi-affiliation with Christianity. The Taipings were able to conquer about one-third of the country and set up a rival capital in Nanking before Hong died, and the Qing put down the rebellion in 1864 with the encouragement of foreigners, who saw the continuing death and destruction as bad for business. All told, the rebellion lasted 15 years and cost an astonishing 20 to 30 million lives through war, famine, and plague. After the rebellion, several Manchu nobles, including many of the generals that had fought against the Taipings, acknowledged that reforms were necessary. They instituted the self-strengthening movement, which undertook limited modernizations primarily aimed at China's military industry. The army was re-equipped, and a modern standing navy developed. The movement recognized China's technological backwardness and tried to reform China, adopting a Chinese philosophical term Ti-yong, or essence/function, saying that in its effort to self-strengthen, the essence of the effort would remain Chinese, but for function they would adopt certain Western technology and methods. This marks the first effort to modernize by adopting Western methods, an effort that had been highly successful in Japan. It is also significant that the movement recognized the link between technology and national security. However, most of the Manchu nobility opposed these developments and were unimpressed with the technology of the West, which was emerging from the Industrial Revolution. Qing leaders emphasized that moral and cultural superiority were paramount and that the technology of the West, though clever, was insignificant. In 1867, one of the emperor's tutors wrote a pamphlet titled "No Need for Western Learning," and argued that, quote, "a nation's greatness is due to virtues, not transient advantages, for no country has ever become strong by relying on achievements in technology," end quote. This quote demonstrates the hidebound conservatism that helped block needed reforms in China. The Empress Dowager Cixi famously diverted funds from the navy to build a new summer palace, including, ironically, a decorative stone boat, neither seaworthy nor of much use against foreign invaders. So when the Japanese crushed the Chinese navy in the 1894-1895 Sino-Japanese War, it should have proved the reformers' point. Instead, the Qing nobles blamed the loss on the reformers for failing in their efforts to effectively modernize the Chinese military, and further Qing efforts to modernize were largely abandoned. This loss gave Japan control over Korea and Taiwan, and marked the shift of power in East Asia from China to Japan. At this time, some commentators started to refer to China as the sick man of Asia, a term that is still repeated by the Chinese as a reminder of this painful period in their history. Failure to reform or to adequately respond to the challenge from the West and Japan led to numerous uprisings in the late 19th and early 20th century, most notably the Boxer Rebellion, which further depleted the dynasty's coffers. These uprisings ultimately resulted in the collapse of the Qing dynasty in 1911. Unfortunately, the forces that opposed the Qing were only unified in opposition, but not in how to fix the many problems that plagued China. Sun Yat-sen declared the founding of the Republic of China on October 10, 1911, but was unable to fully replace the governing structures of the Qing, and China quickly devolved into a period of warlordism and civil war. From the collapse of the Qing through the founding of the PRC 38 years later, there was no single governing authority in China. Foreigners still held on to their various enclaves, warlords had various fiefdoms, and the nationalist or Kuomintang, KMT, and later the Chinese Communist Party or CCP, carved out various spheres of influence. One poignant aspect of this period, popularized in the Bruce Lee film Fists of Fury, and certainly a potent story passed around in China, was about a sign at the gates of a park in Shanghai that read, "No dogs or Chinese allowed." In the movie, Bruce Lee heroically destroys the sign with a flying kick after being denied entry into the park. The sign, in fact, never existed. The actual sign, erected in 1917, is shown here. It does say that the gardens are, quote, reserved for the foreign community, end quote, and later that, quote, dogs and bicycles are not admitted, end quote. In fact, Chinese were allowed into the park as indicated by Regulation 8, and other reports that Chinese were allowed as guests of foreign residents. Now, that doesn't erase the fact that Chinese were treated as second-class citizens in their own country, but the false narrative of the "No Dogs or Chinese Allowed" sign is a powerful symbol of the century of humiliation and often repeated in Chinese media. I highly recommend, if you get the chance, to take a boat cruise on the Huangpu River in Shanghai, which has dramatic views of the Bund, a strip of Western commercial buildings from the late 19th and early 20th century, and the amazing modern skyline of Pudong on the other side. But even today, the English recording used on the tour boat will identify Huangpu Park as the place where the sign was hung reading, "No Dogs or Chinese Allowed." China joined the Allied forces during the First World War, providing laborers in support of British, French, and Russian troops. However, Chinese interests were largely ignored during the negotiations for the Treaty of Versailles, signed in April 1919. Instead of giving German possessions within Chinese territory back to China, they were turned over to Japan. Japan made an additional 21 demands on the weak governing authority in Beijing to secure Japanese interests in Manchuria, which bordered its colony in Korea. The Chinese authorities agreed to all of Japan's demands. On May 4th, university students led demonstrations against the governing authority in Beijing. The May 4th movement had the effect of radicalizing Chinese thought, and the sense of betrayal by Western democracies undermined the support of many in China for the development of democratic institutions. This movement ultimately led to the founding of the Communist Party of China 2 years later. When Chiang Kai-shek ultimately emerged as the leader of KMT forces in 1925, he was much more interested in wiping out the communists than in dealing with the encroachment of the Japanese. He famously remarked that the Japanese were a disease of the skin, but the communists were a disease of the heart. Ultimately, Japan took Manchuria in 1931 and began its attempt to gain control of the rest of China in 1937. Chiang Kai-shek was captured by a local warlord in Xi'an and forced to agree to a united front with the communists against the Japanese. Because of the disunity, the Japanese had little difficulty seizing most of eastern China, ushering in perhaps the darkest period of China's century of humiliation. In late 1937, as the Japanese closed on the nationalist capital of Nanking, the Osaka Mainichi Shimbun and its sister newspaper, the Toko Nichi Shimbun, covered a contest between two Japanese officers, Toshiaki Mukai and Tsuyoshi Noda, in which the two men were described as vying with one another to be the first to kill 100 Chinese. After the Japanese took Nanking in December of that year, they killed an estimated 300,000 Chinese in a 6 weeks-long orgy of sexual assault and killing that is now known as the Rape of Nanking or the Nanking Massacre. I visited the Nanking Massacre Museum, and it is a sobering experience, similar to visiting the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., or the Hiroshima Memorial Museum in Japan. I can only imagine that the effect is far greater on the Chinese, who study the massacre in textbooks and see it depicted in popular films. While the Nanking Massacre remains a particularly galling reminder of China's weakness during this period, overall an estimated 15 to 20 million Chinese were killed during the Second World War, a number exceeded only by the Soviet Union. Being weak and divided left China vulnerable not only to invasion, but also unable to respond to a series of natural and not-so-natural disasters. Terrible flooding in the Yangtze River Basin in 1931 and 1935, and subsequent famine and cholera outbreaks killed an estimated 2 to 4 million people. The 1931 floods are rated as the deadliest in history, in a list that China easily dominates overall, owning the top 5 slots. Then in 1938, in a futile attempt to hinder Japanese military advances, Chiang Kai-shek ordered that the dikes on the Yellow River be deliberately breached, which killed an estimated 800,000. Then a famine in Henan province in 1942 and 1943 killed 2 to 3 million people and created another 4 million refugees. The severity of such disasters demonstrated the fecklessness of the government, but also had a metaphysical component. As I mentioned, the mandate of heaven was traditionally viewed as the emperor's divine right to rule. Losing the mandate of heaven was often believed to be manifest through natural disasters. Although the dynastic system had ended in 1911, the nationalist government undoubtedly was seen by the Chinese populace as having lost the mandate of heaven due to war, pestilence, and natural disasters that occurred during this period. In the next lecture, we'll discuss the Chinese Civil War and China's continued suffering under Mao Zedong and the Communists, and how all of this influences China's worldview today.